This is the last lecture. This is some cool things because guess what? We're going to talk today about social psychology. And I'm going to finish up by putting up one quick slide on health psych. And as I do that, you can write it down, and I want you to look at the material in the textbook. And there's just a little bit to pay attention to when it comes to coping with stress. And I wanted to end our last topic on health psychology by having you look at ways to cope with stress. And I just kind of summarize some of the key things that are in there in that section on coping with stress and from how we analyze what's stressful for us. Confession has been one of those powerful concepts related to the idea of forgiveness that can be very deep and powerful in helping people overcome some of their stress and anxiety. Learning to sleep, relax, and exercise, biofeedback and monitoring. And then we talked a little bit about type A behavior last time and the relationship of our spiritual lives with the area of stress and health. In particular. So as kind of just a summary to health psych, I'll leave the screen up for just a minute. What I want to do today is shift over to social psychology, and this is an area that is important in many respects. It's the last topic, and there's a chapter on this that you need to make sure and get read. Obviously before the final, but the final will cover health psych and social psych. And so I'm going to cover, mostly today, we're going to talk about social psychology. And this is what I got my master's and my PhD in, is in social psychology. I've been studying it for a long time. And it's a cool topic. And so it's kind of how we started this class. Anybody remember back when, the very first day of class, we were talking about why people behave and why we do what we do and how we explain another person's behavior. And so really we're going to pick up that last kind of topic today and kind of as a continuation from the whole semester of explaining and looking at human behavior. And that's what social psychologists do, is they explore and look at why people do what they do, why we behave in certain social situations in a way. And so that's the plan today, is to just cover this, to do it in detail so we can watch a couple of different ways and see our behaviors in light of how they're looked at by social psychologists and some of the key findings that we have found in the field of social psych. So that's the plan. We're going to talk about attributions, conformity and compliance, and obedience, and then finish with a topic called group influences. And a lot of this material is to me, really, really interesting because it helps us to answer questions like this. Why do people do what they do? We do some weird things. Have you ever seen somebody, for example, when they're walking and if they trip? Anybody notice anything? If you've ever watched somebody trip, which is not an uncommon occurrence for a lot of us, so you're walking down and all of a sudden you trip, what's a common behavior to do after a person trips? Okay, they might laugh, and why would they might feel a little bit. If it's you feel a bit awkward. Some of you, I've noticed, and maybe you've seen this before, maybe you've done this, have you ever tripped and turn around and see what maybe made you trip? So you look around, see what made you maybe trip, or I've seen people, anything else you've seen them do? Any of you all try and pretend like you were starting to jog when you tripped? Like, I was just starting to run. I always start all of my runs with a trip. Why would we do that? The answer is oftentimes based upon things that we know about other people. They're seeing us, and if we see somebody trip, tell me what you would attribute their behavior to. If you were sitting here and someone comes walking down and they trip, right, just with nothing there, what might you think about them? You might think to yourself real quickly, oh, they're a little bit clumsy. or that was funny or awkward. And we could potentially explain their behavior about or based upon maybe their clumsiness. And so if we trip, we're very much aware of the fact that we go through attributions like this. And so we try and tell the other person, oh no, I was actually walking, starting to jog. And so what we're going to talk about in here is when we have behaviors that occur in a social, in a social setting, we do certain things to explain that, and as we explain those behaviors, we're very much aware of it. You are strongly influenced by social situations, and your behavior and my behavior is influenced by that. I want you to be thinking about examples about your behavior being influenced by social situations and by the most interesting things that occur. Oftentimes, we'll find people behave differently if they're alone than if they're in a large group of people. And that's an interesting thought. You will change your behavior based upon somebody's dress. Do you believe that? They had a person, you can try this. You go up to a person sitting in a chair or standing somewhere and tell them to move. And just go up to them and say, excuse me, you need to move over to this chair, please. They've done this. They've had people standing there waiting for a bus, and they're standing on this side, and a person walks up to them and says, excuse me, you need to stand on the other side of that post right there. What would you do if you're just standing there hanging out for a bus, which isn't likely in Los Angeles, but some of you have been on buses recently, or just standing there and someone says, excuse me, you need to stand over there. What would you do? What if somebody walked up to you and said, hey, you need to go, see that guy over there? He's parking his car in that meter. He doesn't have any money for his meter. Go give him a quarter, or go put a quarter in his meter. What would you do? What would you do if somebody said, go put a quarter in that guy's meter? What do most people do? How many say you would go put a quarter in? If somebody just walked up to you and said, hey, that guy doesn't have any money, could you go put a quarter in his meter? Look at you guys are so nice. How many would say, I would not go put the quarter in the meter? That doesn't make any sense to me. What if you had the quarter? You see, we make quick decisions about people, and guess what we have found? That people who are dressed just like us get obeyed when we tell people to do something at around 17%, 20% of the time. If you go to tell somebody, excuse me, you need to move over into this chair, there's about 20% of the people that go, oh, okay. What could I change about the situation to get clearly more than 50% of the people, as high as 70% of the people to actually move or to go put a quarter in the meter? What would I change about the situation? My outfit. What could I wear differently that would get all kinds of people to obey me? Any form of a uniform. Any form of a uniform. Any uniform. Are we influenced by somebody wearing a uniform? The answer seems to be, we are influenced by people wearing uniforms. We're influenced by other people in general, but people wearing, how does that come into play here? Well, it's huge in one big area when it comes to social conformity, and in particular when it comes to obedience. You see, social psychology tries to explain something that we've been dabbling with all semester, and that is this. How people think and influence and relate to one another is what social psychology is about. How do we think about other people? Why do we make an attribution about somebody that says they're a bad driver, they're clumsy, they're mean or angry? What variables go into that? Suppose you're sitting there in a cafeteria, and I think we talked about this, but somebody is in the cafeteria and they take a bowl of cereal and they pour it on somebody's head. And then they walk out. How many remember us talking about this? Anybody? We talked about taking a bowl of cereal, let's say, and you're sitting there in this cafe, and all of a sudden now someone takes the cereal and they just dump it on somebody and they walk out. Somebody explain, if you're sitting there, To what do you attribute that person's behavior? Let's say she is sitting there with a he, and you can't hear their conversation, you just see the cereal flying, and now he's covered. And she gets out and walks away. Somebody raise your hand and explain, why did she do what she did? Give me an attribution about her behavior. Why? You quickly have now tallied up why she did it. Why did she do it?
Maybe she's angry at him for some reason.
There's something, she's angry at him for some reason. Okay, so she's angry. We'll put that on this side of the ledger. Give me another reason why someone would do that in the middle of just sitting there. She's angry. What else? What else might go through your mind? She just pours a bowl of, cereal.
Break up.
They just broke up. Okay? All right, so she is what? Upset, angry, just broke up. Give me another one.
A joke.
It was a joke? Maybe it was just simply she was trying to see what would happen.
Maybe he totally offended her?
She was offended because of something he said or did. So obviously his behavior either got her angry or got her offended, right? Somebody else. What goes through your mind if you were to see this event occur? What would you think? Would you come up with are there any other ways to explain her behavior? What could possibly have gone on? Maybe something else. He cheated. Or did you say she did or he did? Yeah, they were dating and he cheated. And so she found out and went, there you go. Anything else? How many would think that it would be pretty accurate, your attributions? How do we do that? How do you think about people? To what do you attribute a person's behavior? And what variables come into play in explaining what somebody else is doing? We said, okay, people change based upon things like wearing a uniform. We might treat this person differently depending upon what we thought. If we thought to ourselves, she did this because she's very angry, very hostile, very unfriendly, your interactions with her are going to be different than if you thought, oh, she's not angry, hostile, and she's not like that normally, or I've never seen anybody do this before, or even her. There must have been some provocation. She did something because she was provoked. He must have done something to her. And your interactions will be very different depending upon how we explain their behavior. So this process of explaining or predicting somebody's behavior is really the main goal of social psychology. Why people behave the way they do and why we think the way we do is massively important to how we interact with people, and therefore how social behaviors unfold. So we do lots of little weird things. We obey people with uniforms differently. You obey people differently if they are an authority figure than if they are not an authority figure. We act differently in groups of people if we believe we're anonymous. If we can kind of blend in, we will do things differently than if we don't blend in with people. And that makes this a very interesting topic. So we start with trying to say we're going to explain social behavior, which is similar to a field of like sociology, who will look at broader social behaviors. Maybe they'll look at how people from one cultural group might differ from a person from a different cultural group. Social psychology tries to look at individual behaviors within a group and how a group might influence a person's behavior. And so that's how it's a little bit different. So we're going to start with the first area, this area called attributions. How do we make an attribution, and what goes into coming up with explanations for people? And so it starts with this process. We see somebody behave in a particular way, and then we attempt to infer the cause of that behavior. Somebody trips, we might tend to say, oh, everybody trips in that spot. It's not the person that's clumsy, and we would attribute that to the situation. But oftentimes, one of our errors is we tend most likely to attribute another person's behavior to their disposition. So if somebody's driving pretty, let's say, fast or wild or cutting people off on the freeway, we would tend to attribute that person's driving behavior to them. And we say, oh, they're just a bad driver, they're crazy, they're whatever. Versus there could be a situational explanation. Give me a situational explanation for somebody who might be driving really bad on a freeway. Okay, they could be drunk, and that would be dispositional. There's something about them. What's a situational?
Medical emergency.
Maybe there's a medical emergency. I remember when my wife said that we were going to have our baby. And it was about like 2 a.m, and she goes, Chris, guess what? Baby's coming. And I'm like, oh, really? It's like now. Like, oh. So we got in the freeway, and at this time we came all the way from this part of Los Angeles down to Orange County, or to the hospital. And it was a good, 20 minutes, and I drove like crazy. It was really fun. Because I also thought, the guy pulls me over, I got a great excuse. Like, check her out, man. And I think the cop would have went, oh, but they didn't pull me over. But I was flying, cutting, moving, doing all kinds of things that now I had a good reason to do it. So it could be that you would have saw me, and the explanation could be, yeah, he's a bad driver, or it could be a situation, right? The situational causes then seem to happen. But our tendency, if you had to believe people erred in making an attribution about somebody, do we tend to believe and make an attribution that it's about the person when we explain behavior or the situation? What do you think? Are people most likely to, watching somebody else, do we explain their behavior based upon that person's disposition or the situational influences? What would you think is the error we tend to make more often? We almost always err on the side of dispositions. So if you're standing in line and someone in front of you at the store, at the grocery store, all of a sudden starts to yell at the person who's checking them out, and you just hear them go, this stinks, I hate you, blah, blah, and they yell at them and walk out, we tend to go, ooh, that's an angry person. That person, and we attribute their behavior a lot to their disposition. Now, it's possible, if we stayed around long enough, that maybe out of every 10 people that go through that line, every 10th person yells at this person, and it's always the same person they're yelling at. Suppose you watch 15 people do that. Would you now think it's disposition, or would you think it's situational? If you watch the same thing occurring, and it happens to be the same checkout person, we go, oh, they must be saying or doing something to people to tick them off. So it has more to do with the situation. So this process leads us to attribute causes. And this is a really fun area to study. And one of the cool things about it is we tend to make a bias in this, and our bias tends to be towards attributing cause to the person, to the disposition. In fact, we have a name for it. It's called the fundamental, because it happens so regularly and frequently, we call it the fundamental attribution error. And this error is the tendency of people who are observing other people to overemphasize the person who's doing the acting, the throwing of the cereal, or the yelling, or the driving bad, or just simply doing whatever. We tend to overemphasize them as the cause of events. It's known as the fundamental attribution error. It's so common, so researched and found that people's tendency is to do this that we call it fundamental. Can you think of any situations in which you have, or you're prone or likely to do this? Can you think about times in which this error might come into play in your thinking when you explain somebody else's behavior, which is, by the way, all the time? Can you think of any examples where people might tend to attribute cause to the observer or to the actor, and they overemphasize that versus the situation? Can you think of anything? I'll give you a couple of hints. Did you have one?
Weddings.
Oh, like what were you thinking? But, okay, so that might be, in a wedding, you might see the bride might be acting in a certain way, and we might think, wow, she's very emotional or very whatever, and maybe not taking into account the gravity or the stress of the situation. Good. Think of something else. Any other examples? Here's some ones that kind of come up. By the way, this is probably why ventriloquism works. If you watch a ventriloquist, and the person has like the doll that is supposedly, we kind of get into that act or kind of watch it and laugh because it's pretty easy to kind of almost attribute that behavior to that doll. Now, we don't believe that's happening, but it's almost as if they take on a personality, and it's pretty easy for us to kind of see that as, and so we kind of buy into this. There are times in which you'll find people who are actors, we tend to overemphasize them and almost, if you heard this, being typecast. And we think of people this way, and if they played a role, and we've seen, there was a student in a play here who played a role. I had a hard time interacting with them without thinking they were that person. And so it wasn't a very good role for them. And I found myself, when I'd see this person on campus, it would be like, oh, well, you're not a very nice person. And that was a role they had to play. Have you heard of anybody that's an actor or an actress share this before? They're like, people sometimes treat me this way. You ever seen Star Wars, the old ones, where there was the guy named Spock? How many familiar?
That's Star Trek.
I mean Star Trek. What did I say? What did I say? Oh, Star Wars, sorry. Yeah, it's a new Star Wars, and Spock's in it. It's really weird. In this show called Star Trek with Spock, and how many of you know who Spock is? He's the guy what is he like? He's unemotional, he's very logical, and he's very much this, I'm not going to let emotions be a part of this. And in Star Trek, he was very well known, and people would recognize him, and so much so that the actor himself is a guy named Leonard Nimoy. Leonard Nimoy would go around and everybody would talk to him as if he was Spock. He wrote a book about his experience, and he titled his book, I Am Not Spock. Because he couldn't go anywhere. People would say, oh, hey, Spock, and wow, it must be hard to be so logical. He goes, dude, I'm Leonard Nimoy, I'm an actor. That's not the way I am. But we treat people that way. We find, there's some weird things that go on with this. Ready? This is pervasive. This isn't just like a cool little funny weird things. People that are victims of crime are thought of oftentimes as responsible for their crime. We sometimes say to them, where were you? What were you doing? Why were you doing that when that happened? As if they asked for that crime to happen to them. You see, because this attribution is so easy for us to see somebody yell and scream at somebody else, and we think to ourselves, wow, that's an angry, mean person. But if we do that, we would say, oh, but I explain my behavior very differently. In fact, we call that almost the counter to the fundamental attribution error is my behavior. I don't scream and yell because I'm an angry person. It's because of something I've done, or something that's been done, rather, to me. Does that make sense? My behavior is because of external situational causes. Your behavior or other people's behavior is because of something about their personality. Does that make sense, the difference? When we trip, it's because we were pushed or there was something that tripped us. When somebody else trips, it's because they are clumsy. Does that all make sense? And attribution theorists have been studying this and our tendencies to do this. And my challenge to you is think about different ways this happens to you. It's so pervasive and it happens a lot. And as you start to think about it and let it process, come up with examples. Think about some. And I don't know if you could do that now. I'll give you an example of an actor-observer effect that occurred with me when I was, it was a football game, It was a very important football game. It was under the lights and it was snowing. And I was a wide receiver and I went up to the quarterback after a lot. This was a championship game. A lot of snow, under the lights, and I went up and there were a series of plays that the other wide receiver kept dropping the ball. So in this game, I went up and here are my exact words. Quarterback's name was Alan. Alan, stop throwing him the ball. He's not a good receiver. Is that an attribution error? What am I saying about his receiving abilities? He's not any good. He's missing everything. Does that make sense? So I literally said those words, Alan, stop throwing him the ball, throw it to me. So he did. And it was a very important play. And I was wide open. And I was like way wide open. And here comes the ball. And I will say this, if I had made the catch, and if I do make the catch, we win the game. That's how close it was toward the end of the game. And so here comes the ball, and I don't know if I told you, but the lights were very bright, and the snow was hitting you in the eye. And I couldn't see anything, and he didn't throw it very well, and it was wobbly, and I go like that, and it hits me, and it drops on the ground. And do you think I went back to the huddle and said, oh man, I'm a bad receiver, like I said about the other guy? What did I say? You threw a wobbly pass and it hit me here instead of there, and the lights and the snow is horrible. It hit me in the eye. That's what I said. You see, that's my behavior is because of what? The snow, the lights, the bad things out there, the bad pass. Everybody else is just a bad receiver. That's the actor-observer effect. I trip because I was pushed. You trip because you're clumsy. Does that make sense? All right. We won the game, by the way. Nobody cares, but I do. And I caught it. I caught the next pass. Isn't that awesome? Yeah, whatever. So, yeah, no, but I caught it, and it was like, yeah, I was all happy. And then I said, he's not a bad receiver. He was fine. Everything's good at that point. Actor-observer effect is the tendency for us to do this. Can you think of examples? There's a ton of these where we, victims of crime, typecasting actors and actresses, it's even why ventriloquism works. So all of these happen. Well, there's one other one that attribution theorists and others look at in social psychology, and that is if it's something that's positive, something good happened, it tends to be, the reason I made the catch at the end was because I'm a really whatever. It's because I gave a lot of effort and I have good abilities. But if something negative happens, it's because of external factors. And it's just it's just another way of talking about a particular outcome that's positive is going to occur because of me doing this. Negative outcome, look, and somebody messed up, whatever. Okay? Are there any questions about attribution error? Does it make sense? Our tendency, and how we do this? Any questions? All right. There's also, this can happen, you could think about, if you get a good grade, it's because your effort and ability. If you get a bad grade, it's because it's a bad class, bad exam, didn't take into account anything, it was a stupid test. How many of you have ever said that before? Like, it was a stupid test, man, it was bad. And maybe it was. It could have been a bad test. That's called the self-serving bias. We have to be very careful about all of these. So social psychologists have studied these things for a long time, and it's pretty cool to look at that. So pay attention to some of that in the textbook. No questions? Move on. All right. Last opportunities for self-serving bias, actor, observer, fundamental attribution error. All right, so in situations that call for us to behave in a certain way, one of the things that we've been exploring is also how do people behave when people ask them to do something or demand that they do something in obedience. So another important topic is this social influence. And that idea of conformity, compliance, and obedience, where it starts off, which we're all very familiar with, and that's conformity. Let me ask you this today. Give me an example of some way in which you have conformed to some attitude or behavior that's a group norm. Raise your hand, and something that you've done today that is conforming.
Well, I haven't done it today yet, but just, everyone doesn't use trays in the calf.
The use of trays in the calf or the not use of trays. What is it today? Is it not using trays? Is that the most conforming thing? You shouldn't use trays. Is that the idea? Unless you're a freshman. Most people don't use trays. Is that right? Is that a conforming thing? Would you say? How many agree that that's a conformity issue, and maybe if nobody's around, you might use a tray? If no one, I don't know if you would do that or not. What is conformity? Is it a way that give me another way that you've conformed. Well, let's try another example.
In California, a lot of people say "like" in their words.
Oh, okay. Some of our language, we might say "like" a lot. Like all the time, huh? Like almost every time you hear somebody talk and they're like using it. And it's like hard not to use it if you try and do it. And then you're like, why did I start doing that? This is wrong. So people use the words, filler words, like. Give me another example of how you might conformed already.
My sophomore year, people went barefoot or wore sandals.
Oh, a lot of people maybe barefoot or sandals.
All the time.
And they're wearing sandals. Give me another example. That's good. Today, how are you conformed? You're wearing clothes. Are y'all? Coming to class, raising your hands, your hair, your hairstyle, your dress style. Are those conformity? Stood in line. How many stood in line today to get your drink or get your non-tray items? Have you ever tried to break any of these norms? And have you ever felt that way? Remember we started class, have you ever tried to get on an elevator and face the wrong way? Did anybody do that yet? It's hard to do. Did anybody this semester go up to the people serving the food and say, I'd like mashed potatoes, please. I don't want it on a plate, I want it right there in my hand. And the person back there is going to go, what? Yeah. And you're saying, no, right there. I don't even use a tray or a plate. And I'm not even going to use a fork, baby. Watch. Put it in there. Okay? Would you guys find it hard to conform to some things or to violate norms? They're really, really hard to violate a norm. We will try walking backwards wherever you go. It's really hard to do. Try doing other things that kind of seem it's appropriate, and don't do any odd things, but you'll find it's really weird to violate a standard or a group norm simply because, so we've done this. We put people in a situation in which, like this row right here, and we said to all y'all, you're going to be in an experiment right now, and we want you to give us your answers. And we say, okay, we want to see, do people who come into a room to take a little simple test, would they conform if the answer was obvious and wrong? And so, by the way, the person who studied this was a guy named Solomon Asch, who started this probably back even in the 60s and 70s. He started some of his research. But he would put subjects in this dilemma because everybody around them would be giving the wrong answer. What would you do? What if you're studying, what if you tried this? Ready? You're studying with 4 people for a test. It's coming up close to the final now, and you know the answer that all 4 of you, you've all been studying and looking at this, and but now all of a sudden you get to one question as you're studying, and they all have they have one answer, and you have a different answer. You came up with something different than 4 people that you've always worked with, you've always studied with. They came up with this answer, and you have this answer, and now you don't have time. You walk into the test, and that question is now on the test. Do you go with your answer or do you go with the other 4 people? That's the dilemma you face. Do you conform or not? The pressure that Ash put people under in this dilemma study was similar. He would go like this, and he would ask this row of people, which comparison line matches with this standard line? And the answer would be, and we'd say it out loud, is 2. 2. 2. 2. And we go just like that. And everything's fine. It's 2. And the study goes on. And then he goes to the next study. And the obvious answer is 2. And then this person says 2 and 2 and 2 and 2 and 2. And by the way, unbeknownst, tell me your name.
I'm Zach.
Zach. Unbeknownst to Zach, he's the only one that's the true subject. Everybody else is part of my study. And they've all been told, answer 2 until you get to a certain trial, and then do the wrong answer, because we want to see what Zach will do. Does that make sense? So he goes like this, 2, and then what's this study? What's the answer to this one? And they go 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, and 2. And then he goes like this. What's the answer to this? And the person goes 3. What does, by the way, is it Zach? Did you say? What does Zach do at that point usually? Person says, ready, what's the answer to this one? And you say? 3. He goes like this. Usually, in most experience, he goes like that. He kind of looks like, dude, that was messed up. And then this person says, 3. And then this person says, 3, and 3, and 3. And now it's Zach's turn. What's Zach going to say?
3.
How many of you would say, I'm saying 3? By the way, what percentage of the time do people conform to an obvious wrong answer? The answer is only about 24% of the time will this person step away from what these answers are and go with his own answer. So 76% of the people will, in many of these different trials, will at some point conform to the obvious wrong answer. Why do people do that? Zach, why did you do that?
Because everyone else is doing it.
Because everybody else is doing it. It feels better to be part of the crowd rather than to stand out. We want to be, also, maybe they go like this sometimes. Zach will go like this and people will look, and then they'll look again, and then they'll look again and think, I must be messed up or something must be wrong because they've been fine before, and they want to be right and they want to be liked. And so they many of the times they just simply, now not all the time. It's not all the time they do this. But enough of the time people feel this pressure to conform. And that's what Solomon Asch studied. Can you think of examples in which it's really hard to violate the norm? Sometimes our conformity could be, it's really, really hard. Today I had a meeting with a whole bunch of other administrators. There was only one person, well, there were actually 2 out of 10 were in that room without a tie on. That was hard. And so why? Well, who cares? It's a tie. It's a piece of cloth that you put here and you wear it down. But everybody wore one, and I felt like, oh, I should have wore a tie. And I was kind of looking around, I should have wore a tie. But I didn't. And I actually feel pretty good about it. But I can tell you that there was the feeling that I should have conformed to that. Is that conformity? It's the pressure to conform. So if I would have went and just put on a tie, even though I don't want to, but everybody else does, or they wear a certain thing, we're giving in to that. It's not bad. Standing in line is not a bad thing. We conform most of the time. Okay, Solomon Asch's study, we tend to conform because we want to be liked and we want to be right. We want to be liked and we want to be right. We also tend to conform more in a situation in which 7 people out of the 8 have already given the wrong answer. We tend to look at the group. If we like the group, if they've been right enough times, we'll oftentimes go along with them if there's numbers like that. But sometimes, if just one person breaks away, like if the answer was obviously 1, but if this person said 3, 3, 1, 3, 3, now Zach has got somebody on his side, and he oftentimes goes 1. Somebody, they saw it like I did. And so that really changes your numbers. And so why we conform, we design, so there's the numbers. If you outnumbered 8 to 1, about 37% of the time they give the conforming answer. It drops down in this particular study to only about 10% if there's a kind of a peer that goes with you. Okay? So at the end of the day, 37% of people, and you could find these numbers in your textbook on conformity, will be unable to break away, and they're just going to go ahead in that situation and say, I'm just going to go with the obvious wrong answer. So why we conform? We like to be liked and we want to be right. And conformity is a very powerful and important kind of norm that we all do and follow. It just kind of helps society go along, and we tend to do it in a way, and it would be odd if everybody didn't conform. You'd have all kinds of chaos, and so there's some benefits to it. Another one that's important is something called compliance. Compliance here in conformity, it's almost this assumed group norm. In compliance, somebody's actually having you or giving you a request to change your behavior or to do something. And so we think about this a lot in situations where somebody is saying, hey, would you fill out this survey for me? Hey, would you be able to do something for me? Hey, could you help me with this? Hey, would you mind taking just this quick little survey for me? Or could I borrow something for, well, any of those requests can be influenced by the thing that occurred right before the request. Many times, our compliance to certain requests oftentimes depends on what happened right before the person asked you the question. So if the ultimate question is, hey, would you take a group of students to the zoo? They are, let's say, elementary school students. Would you take them to the zoo this weekend for 2 hours? Takes 2 hours. Just go and do it for us. Would you do that? That's a direct request. By the way, in that study, when they just simply asked people, somewhere around 17, almost 20% of the people went, sure, why not? I don't know, you need somebody to go, I'll go. 2 hours, yep, I'll do it. We can get close to 50% of people to be able to agree to do this. 50%. If they did a door in the face technique. They asked a large request first. And then they asked the request of, would you take somebody to the zoo? Give me an example of a large request, a door in the face. Can you think of something? They went up to people and they said, hey, would you go work and volunteer? It's about 6 hours a week, every week for the rest of the semester. For like 15 weeks in the spring semester, 6 hours a week, it's volunteer. Would you go do that and volunteer with this group of people, let's say in this home with kids, 6 hours? And almost everybody said, no, I can't do that. 6 hours a week, I don't have time. Almost everybody said no. But if you then said, that was the large request, but then you said, oh, okay, if you can't do that, do you think you'd take people to the zoo this weekend for 2 hours? 50% of the people said, oh, I can do that. Do you see the difference? Now you get 50% of the people agreeing to your request if you simply asked them something big and they turned you down. That is a human tendency to comply depending upon what request came first. Sometimes a small request could be, hey, do you have the time? Yeah, sure, it's whatever time. Hey, do you think you could take 3-question survey for me? And then people are more likely to agree because you had a small request, and then they agreed to a second larger request called the foot in the door. So these are all kinds of techniques People know about, salesmen use them, compliance and social psychologists study. Why do people agree to do things, and what occurs and what doesn't need to happen, and what influences people to agree to a certain kind of request? All right, those are compliance techniques. One last topic in this area of social influence is obedience. And obedience is when somebody says, you need to do this, or you need to change that, or you need to agree to do something, and they demand it of you. And the question about how often people obey to demands is one of those very important types of influences that has come into play and studied. And so let me show you an experiment of a researcher by the name of Stanley Milgram. How many have heard of Stanley Milgram's obedience studies? Yeah. Stanley Milgram had an obedience study in which he began to ask the question, who will obey, and how far could he get people to obey? And so he would do this. He would hook up people to a shock generator, and he would say, we wanted to find out, would you obey and hurt somebody? And I want you to answer this question. Think about it to yourself. How many people, if I brought them into the room, would actually hurt somebody by shocking them every time they got an answer to a question wrong? The person who is the learner and not the teacher, the learner gets to learn this list. Ready? They learn a whole list of things. And they get time to practice it, and they think, and they're the learner. And then the teacher's holding a shock generator like this. And then they say, all right, now it's time to take the test. And let's start. And the learner is now going, all right, the answer to 1 is A, and it's right, great. The answer to 2, they say, I think the answer to 2 is B. And the person says, wrong, you're now going to get a shock. And the person goes, ah, that hurt. The question that Milgram set up was, would people, how far would they shock them? How many volts would they give them of electricity before they went, oh, I'm not going to do that anymore? That's too much voltage. That would hurt too bad. Will people naturally drop out after a certain level has been made or achieved of voltage? And that's what he did. He studied this. And the results were very surprising. So here's the 1963, if you can believe it, 1963 study depicted in this video clip of a learner and a teacher. And remember, we're looking at the teacher because the teacher, the one that's holding the shock generator, ready? We're seeing, will this person holding the shock generator, will they obey? Will they obey a person that says, shock that person? They just missed a question, shock them again. They missed a question, shock them more. How much do people obey? Or will they stop and they go, I'm not going to obey you? And that was this study that was done. So this is the Stanley Milgram study. This done throughout the 60s, but this, I think, particular clip was from early in the 60s. That shows, you can see all the shock and the levels, strong shock, very strong shock. Different voltages at the top, 185, 255, intense shock. Extreme intense shock, 315. Danger, severe shock. How many people went all the way to 450 is the question.
You want to step right in here, learner, and have a seat there. You can leave your coat on the back of that chair if you will. Take it right off. That's fine. Have a seat right here. Pull yourself right up to the counter, please.
Teacher, you may look on if you'd like while we get set up in here.
Would you roll up your right sleeve, please? Left sleeve. That's fine. Now, what I'm I'm going to do is strap down your arms to avoid any excessive movement on your part during the experiment. Is that too tight? Okay. This electrode is connected to the shock generator in the next room. And this electrode paste is to provide a good contact to avoid any blister or burn. Answer, please.
This is the teacher. We're seeing how much he obeys.
Answer is neck. 300 volts. Continue. The next word is green, please. Green. Grass, hat, ink, apple. If the learner doesn't answer in a reasonable time, about 4 or 5 seconds, consider the answer wrong and follow the same procedures you have been doing for wrong answers. Say wrong, tell them the number of volts, give them the punishment for getting the correct answer. Continue, please. Green, grass, hat, ink, apple. Answer, please. Go on with the procedure, please, teacher. 315 volts. The answer is ink. Next one. You gotta keep getting a shock if you don't answer. Next one is Rich. 330 volts. Next one.
I'll show you more, but I just want to make something clear, by the way. This is the teacher. The question is, how much does he obey? He doesn't know this, but that other guy's not being shocked. So he's just screaming as an actor back there. So just to calm some of you, because you look nervous. He is doing, we wanted to see, what could that learner back there go, ah, I'm not going to answer. We want to say, would this guy still obey? What percentage of people, by the way, he's at 300 volts. The question was, the question is, it goes all the way to 450 volts. X is marked on the screen, 450 volts. What percentage of people like him would go all the way to 450 volts, even if the guy's screaming? What percent? There were people that said, I am not doing this. There were people. What percentage of the people said, I'm not doing this. I'm done with this experiment, even if you tell me you have to? Think about the number that it's coming to mind. What percentage out of 100 would go all the way? Okay.
Excellent. 5. Bird, car, train, plane. Go on, please, with the procedure. Please answer. The answer is bird, 345 volts. Blunt, knife, stick, word, arrow. Answer, please. Continue, please. The answer is arrow, 360 volts. Go on, please, with the experiment. Please continue. Soft, rug, pillow, hair, grass. Answer, please. Go on, teacher. Air, 375 volts. I think something's happened to that phone there. I don't get no answer. He was hollering with less voltage. Can't you check in to see if he's all right, please? Not once we've started. Please continue, teacher. Cool, day, shade, water, cave. Answer, please. Are keep giving them shocks?
Continue.
I'm up to 390.
Continue, please.
Something's happened to that man in there.
The question was, by the way, this guy went all the way to 455 volts. So did 67% of the people. 67% of the people went all the way to 450 volts. 63%. By the way, a good number is this was done in 1963, and that'll help you give the clue as to what percent. Not 1963, 63. 63% of the people, look at this, the victim, in this particular study, everybody went to 15 volts, and everybody went to moderate and strong and very strong and intense. And here the victim started to scream, like what you heard. And a lot of people dropped out, but only about 10% said, oh, I'm not gonna do this anymore, the guy's screaming. And the guy says, well, the shocks may be painful, they're not dangerous, please continue. So we would go, okay. Well, then he would start pounding on the wall. I'm not going to answer, it hurts. And so another 10% of the people would drop out. And then 20% would drop out. But by the time they got to the very end, the 450 volts, and the victim was no longer answering questions, 63% of the people still went like that and did it. And the question was, why? Well, go ahead.
Was he being paid, or was there some sort of a reward or punishment?
No, it's a great question. Was he being paid? The answer was they were being paid. At the time, it was like $5 back then. It'd be like giving you $20 today to be part of the study. So could that have motivated them? Like, I want to get $20. I don't want to leave. I'm going to keep doing this. That was one question they asked. Any other questions do you have? What would you think is going on with that person? Well, by the way, do you think that would happen today? If we did this study today, would we get the same numbers? Might get higher numbers? They did this with males, females. They did it with people of different ethnic groups in different countries, though not every country, they just haven't had time to go and do this. But in almost all these cases, in this scenario, they get about 63% of the people will go all the way. They obey an authority. They don't, you could tell, by the way, that guy was very anxious and very, you could tell being impacted by this. He didn't want to do this. By the way, this study couldn't be done today. It's a study that they deem too risky for the person, that teacher who's sitting there having to push this. He doesn't know the guy's acting. He thinks it's real. And now you're going to reveal to him at the end of the study, well, we just wanted to find out how many people would shock all the way, and you were one of them. And they're like, So it's ethically a study that today would not get approved. This was back in the 60s before they had some of these ethical guidelines in place, but it still revealed some amazing things about people. We tend to obey authority. By the way, check this out. They brought the guy who was the actor out of the room, and they put him in the same room as the other person. Do you think that lowered the rates? When the person could see him getting shocked, remember he's acting like he's getting shocked, going, stop it. But you could see him. Do you think that lowered the rates at all? What if he had to actually not only see him, but he had to, in one case, put his hand on the shock generator, the thing that would shock him, like a plate, like this. And the guy that was doing the shocking, the teacher, had to hold the guy's hand down to get him shocked. Does that make sense? So they're saying, no, you put your hand on there so the guy gets shocked when he misses the answer. And about, well, here's the numbers. 30% of the guys would hold his hand down to get shocked. 65 or 63% when the learner was just heard. When the learner was seen, it went down to about 40%, so it did decrease. And then if they had to physically hold that learner or touch them in some way, not as many complied. And this was a study that was done by Stanley Milgram, mostly because he wanted to find out the answer to this. Do people really obey authorities? Because they had people going to trial for war crimes. And these people would say this in trial: why did you do this horrible behavior, maybe killing an innocent people, and they would say, I was ordered to do it. They told me to do it. They ordered me to do it. I was following orders. And then the question was, do really people follow orders like that? And the answer, unfortunately, has been, over the course of all of these studies in the mid-60s, that they were discovering that people were really pretty obedient to authorities. And then the question why it occurs and how do you resist it became then the focus of study over the next couple of years. And while that study in general wouldn't be done today in that same regard, there are ways of finding out, do people still obey, and the rates seem to be pretty high. But people tend to resist this a little bit more when they find out about the results of studies like this. And we find higher resistance rates when people have been told, hey, listen, you don't have to obey. If somebody's getting hurt, you can say no. And by the way, you see people in this 30%, some 33, 35, 37% of the people would say, I'm not going to do this. I'm out. I don't care. You take your money. I'm done. And they resist, and seeing other people resist has actually helped people to go, oh, I don't have to obey authority who's telling me to do something wrong or bad or that would bring harm to somebody. And resistance is increased when people see models that do that. It occurs, again, because of our high demand to follow authorities and obey them. Oh, any questions on the whole study on obedience? Yeah, go ahead.
Well, this goes back to compliance a little bit. It seems a little manipulative. So, like, what is the reaction from Christians? Like, it may seem kind of not a big deal, but it seems like they're manipulating so many people to comply with bigger complexity.
Yeah, in this regard, like back in the compliance stuff, in that area, there's all kinds of questions that could be asked about the morality, for example, of having somebody, of trying to do something that would get them to behave or comply in a certain area like that. What's been interesting is most of these techniques are pretty much used in sales all the time against people. I think that's the idea that a lot of social psychologists say is you better be prepared. I answered the door, it wasn't maybe a year or two ago, and someone stood there and said, hey, would you be, there was just a simple question that was said like, hey, do you think if I forget what it was, would it be cool for a student like me to be able to go on a vacation to Hawaii or something like that? And I remember answering, I knew what he was doing. It was, he wanted me to answer the question. I said, well, of course it'd be good. Well, then you know what, I can do that. All you have to do is help me buy a magazine. Okay, so it's a technique, there's a way. So I think what happens is that we find a lot of these things occurring out there, and the question is, when are they occurring? Why are they occurring? And what are some, ideas behind it? So yeah, there's a whole philosophy of, behind this as to why they occur, and then even the morality of doing some of that. That's very manipulative. A lot of these are that's exactly what they're doing. So a lot of sales techniques of people doing this. And so the social psychologists that are studying this are trying to say, wow, we have to be really careful that we're buying into these things or that these are influencing us. Good question. Any others on obedience? All right, it's an interesting area. Look at it in the textbook and study it. It is very helpful to explore and to look at some of these behaviors like that. And then in the last one, here's what I'm going to do. I'm just going to put up 4 areas that I want you to look at in the textbook. Social facilitation, and there's a quick definition. It's when your performance is influenced depending upon the presence of others. It's something called social loafing, which is we tend to exert less effort when we're in a group than if we're alone. Something called group polarization and groupthink. These are topics in the textbook I think that are very interesting. And they have some cool examples in there of how each of these work. So look at them, study them, read about them, and Are there any questions about anything we've covered so far?
Is it true that stress brings on gray hair?
Well, stress has physiological effects. So the answer is stress does and can result in things like even getting gray hair, yeah. So does aging.
But how does that happen? Oh, well, is it the aging thing?
Yeah, it is a lot to do with it, and it's what the hair, yeah. It's a good question. Hey, guess what? We're done. Good job this semester, y'all.
Biola University offers a variety of biblically centered degree programs, ranging from business to ministry to the arts and sciences. Visit biola.edu to find out how Biola could make a difference in your life.